you. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Welcome to today's introductions. It is a deep honor for me to be here in front of all of you, given the mission-critical work that you are all doing on marine protected areas. And in my work as a researcher of the mental health impacts of the climate crisis, I deal with a lot of difficult statistics. And I thought I'd begin today by offering you one of those statistics: 39%. That's the global average for how many young people aged 16 to 25 tell us that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis make them hesitant to have their own children one day. Now, this statistic comes from a survey that my colleagues and I conducted with 10,000 youth around the world. We were surveying in India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the US, UK, Australia, France, Brazil, and Finland. And we aimed with the survey to understand how the climate crisis is psychologically affecting our young people. Quite frankly, we were alarmed by what we found. 75% of young people globally say that the future is frightening to them because of the climate crisis. 56% endorsed the statement that humanity is doomed. And 45% reported that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are negatively impacting their daily functioning. That means interfering with daily tasks like eating, sleeping, or concentrating. Now, that interference with daily functioning jumped significantly for youth in the global south who are already bearing the brunts of climate extremes, particularly in India, Nigeria, and the Philippines, which really highlights why this growing conversation around climate and mental health really needs to desperately become a conversation about climate mental health justice. The most reported emotions that the young people shared with us were being sad, afraid, anxious, angry, and powerless. And I tell you all this not to depress you, but to highlight the unbearable burden that our continued rising emissions, still expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, and lack of alignment of real-world policies with what the IPCC tells us we ought to do in order to prevent climate catastrophe is putting on young people worldwide. Now, the young people's thoughts and feelings were also significantly associated with a sense of being failed by governments and betrayed by leaders. And so I, therefore, hypothesize that it isn't that young people around the world are feeling so glum just because the environment isn't doing super well, but because they're starting to feel the psychological effects of what trauma researchers call institutional betrayal. Now, institutional betrayal refers to wrongdoings perpetrated by an institution upon individuals dependent on that institution. And thanks to the intrepid youth climate activism that we have seen in recent years, young people worldwide are continually being held up by today's leaders as the great beacon of hope that will solve the climate crisis. But we should appreciate that while they are powerful, they are also shouldering this responsibility often before they've been able to leave the house, explore the world, figure out important aspects of their identity. Many are not old enough to vote, let alone take up power-holding positions in global politics or run Fortune 500 companies. And at this time, when we experience continued predatory delay to act seriously on the climate from many angles, the WHO has told us in a report that not a single country is adequately protecting children's health today. And so when youth understand this, they're aware and they witness that the institutions that are supposed to protect them are not really upholding their end of the deal, well then, this institutional betrayal can wreak havoc. In the long run, it creates pragmatic harm, and this translates into illness, death, inequality, and economic ruin. In the shorter term, we see psychological harm, leading to more emotional distress and physical distress, and thus, over time, more pragmatic harm. And I believe that the rise of eco-anxiety that we can see around us today is the tip of the iceberg of this sort of harm. Eco-anxiety has been defined by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom. And mental health researchers argue that it's actually much more than anxiety. It's really an umbrella of difficult emotions that a person might experience when confronting the climate and wider ecological crises, co-occurring difficult feelings like anger, grief, terror, rage, maybe a sense of helplessness or powerlessness. And the philosopher Glenn Albrecht tells us that these are psychoterratic emotions, emotions that stem from perceived and directly felt pain of the earth itself. Now, despite the clinical sounding name, eco-anxiety is not a mental disorder. Professionals have rallied to argue that it's actually a natural and normal response to a very real and unfolding threat that is causing us to lose a lot of precious life that we hold dear. And though we are often quick to pathologize anxiety, there's actually a reason why we've evolved to feel it. It can be adaptive when the body sends an anxious signal that something valuable is under threat, and it gets us to mobilize resources in the face of the threat in order to fend off the danger. Therefore, if you have ever experienced eco-anxiety, you can be proud to feel this way. It's a sign of your humanity, that you are compassionate to all that's in harm's way, and there's a strength and a virtue in that. Appreciate that you care about the world so much that it causes you distress. But as the fear of climate chaos escalates among the public at large, along with concerns about how to cope, environmental justice philosopher Kyle White, who is also a member of the Potawatomi Nation, reminds us that for many Indigenous peoples, this all feels like déjà vu. In lands now called Canada and the United States, many Indigenous peoples and customs were decimated as a direct result of colonization's genocidal force and the extractive logics and white supremacy culture that came with it. So those who survived had to learn to adapt amidst new environmental and social pressures. So what we're dealing with now, White argues, is a cyclical repetition as changing environmental pressures threaten health at grand scale, but this time around we are all affected. Many more people are now in harm's way, and disturbingly, many governments are preventing progress where their citizens stand a better chance of adapting. Climate change is a mental health emergency that both directly and indirectly impacts our mental health. This, in turn, can limit the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to take climate action and adapt to its harms, because how battered we feel determines how well we can build a new world. But the cycle need not only be vicious, it can also be virtuous. Because of the deep interconnection between the health of the climate and the health of our mental state, we can enact policies and practices that have co-benefits of solving both problems at once. For example, by increasing the provision of green and blue spaces, the climate will benefit as more carbon dioxide is absorbed by key vegetation, which reduces heat in urban heat islands, for instance. At the same time, our mental health will benefit by giving more people the opportunity to connect with nature, which dramatically improves stress management and simultaneously mitigates against extreme heat's bad impacts on our mental health. A world of multi-solving is available to us. And the more that we can show our young people around the world that we are investing in these kinds of co-beneficial policies, the less rattled they will be. Let's take a brief look now at how climate directly and indirectly impacts mental health. Acute climate stressors include things like extreme weather events and heat waves, where we see that after these events, there's spikes often in post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, domestic abuse, self-harm, suicidality. We know that the psychological impacts of disaster exceed physical injury 40 to 1. And then chronic climate stressors include things like forced migration, food and water shortages, and increasingly, I would argue, doom scrolling through endless bad headlines about the environmental state. This causes mental and emotional distress that wears away at the social determinants of mental health and well-being. Not everyone is affected the same, though. The evidence points out many different, more vulnerable groups. We have children and young people. I've already described a bit of that, but children also bear the brunt of more than 88% of the global burden of disease from climate change. Women, who are more likely to feel eco-anxiety, as well as anxiety and depression, for instance, when on a track of forced migration. People experiencing direct climate impacts and those with limited capacity to adapt, which directly endangers many people with disabilities. People with pre-existing mental illness, who are 2 to 3 times more likely to die in a heat wave. People with livelihoods and cultures strongly connected to the land, including ranchers and farmers, and many Indigenous communities around the world. Here in Canada, foundational research on ecological grief has been conducted in a number of Inuit communities in Labrador by Dr. Ashley Consolo of Memorial University. Ecological grief is a loss related to real environmental change, anticipated future changes, and also aspects of identity or traditions that can wear away along with the stability of a particular ecosystem. And as a result of the rapidly rising temperatures of the circumpolar north, The ice no longer freezes at many times of the year that it used to, which prevents Inuit from hunting, fishing, and carrying out important traditions. The people who Dr. Consola works with says that as Inuit, they are people of the ice, and so are naturally bereft to then ask, what will we do when there is no more ice? In this sense, ecological grief is an existential kind of grief about the world and one's place within it. We also know that eco-anxiety and grief can hit frontline environmental professionals especially hard, from scientists to green policymakers to activists to environmental writers. There is a psychological toll that comes with studiously bearing witness to ecological destruction and caring so much about these problems that we devote our lives to them. In her book, Coral Whisperers, Iris Braverman documents her 4-year ethnographic study of coral scientists who were working during a global bleaching event in which 93% of the Great Barrier Reef bleached. In her own words, she wanted to know how these scientists were coping as the largest living structure on Earth became the largest dying structure on Earth. And after interviewing more than 100 coral scientists, it became clear to her that the entire coral science community operates like a pendulum, swinging between hope and despair. Those who erred on the side of despair were the scientists who chastised local coral restoration projects as being in vain without top-level policy change to curb carbon emissions, since rising global temperatures warms the water, which then worsens the bleaching. On the other hand, those who refused to stop trying to make a difference at a local level through restoration interventions, they held on to their hope, even if it was not entirely rational. So no matter how we cope with difficult environmental realities, many of you might be familiar with some of these common stresses that have been found to be common in climate and conservation professionals. You might feel great urgency to act and prevent harm. You might hold an enormous sense of personal and moral responsibility to use your knowledge for the greater good. You might feel like you're never doing enough, fast enough. You might know that the worst is yet to come. You might feel frustrated if it seems like the people around you in wider society or circles of loving friends and family don't really seem to care, all the while being exhausted by entrenched setbacks in your work from political norms and cultural powers. We might oscillate between being outraged and depressed by these barriers until eventually it can become too much and we burn out, suppress our emotions at the expense of our health, or slip into depression or quit or go numb. I wrote a book called Generation Dread that investigates the diverse ways in which the climate and ecological crises are now impacting people's mental health. While doing my research for it, I was quite shocked to discover how woefully unprepared for the scope of psychic damage that this is causing the mental health fields are. And so I wrote the book to advance a conversation about the need for coping strategies and actions and policies that can protect and promote our mental health in a warming world. I was also, though, particularly disturbed to discover how many lay people have fallen into an unfortunate narratively foreclosing trap that tells them that it's too late to make a difference, that the die is cast when it comes to the climate, and that there's not much we can really do to build a better world. But there is no such thing as too late. As the paleoecologist Jacqueline Gill likes to say, the climate crisis is not a pass-fail test. There's never a point at which it isn't worth it, even if we blow way past our Paris Agreement goals by 2030, because there's always something left to save. Preventing every 1/10 of a degree of warming supports millions of lives. But getting to that place of conviction, especially if you're an eco-anxious person, is a complex experiential process. And if it's not supported, it can really threaten our mental health and well-being, or cause a person to avoid difficult reality altogether, thwarting their ability to take action. But if navigated with compassion and social support, we've seen in the research field time and again that this can be harnessed for deeper meaning in life, as well as courageous climate, biodiversity, and otherwise environmental action. The way that people move through eco-anxiety and grief has actually been mapped out by a Finnish theologian named Panu Pikala. He shows us that people often move through a state of semi-consciousness about how bad these problems are, towards an awakening to the truth that can be so profoundly disturbing that it causes a shock response. At first, this is very disorienting and can cause an internal shattering within some people, particularly if they have been privileged enough to take their security and safety for granted up until this point. But then their climate awareness reveals to them that the world is actually far more tragic and fragile than they were led to believe from their own experience. People at this stage might throw themselves into activism or get lost in grief or keep a distance from the problem, sticking their heads in the sand or doing what they must, like avoiding the news at all costs in order to not be in touch with potentially traumatic information. Dr. Piccola says that it is only when a person learns to integrate their actions that can express their environmental values alongside appropriate engagement with and regulation of difficult emotions, alongside healthy amounts of distancing from the problem, which become not so much avoidance as much as intentional, conscious types of self-care, that then they adjust and transform in a process of learning to live with the ecological crisis in a more balanced way. The need to continue and the need to retreat then remains a delicate tightrope walk. And this form of healthy distancing is why the author and activist Adrienne Maree Brown's statement that what we pay attention to grows is so genius and useful. To sustain ourselves, we need to focus our attention on things that fill us up with joy, pleasure, love, imagination, possibility, connection, despite the urgency of this work. Many an activist have burned out because they have denied themselves these pleasures. This balance is not about avoiding what is heartbreaking, but about stretching ourselves wide enough that we can also focus on uplifting and life-affirming things, or else we end up looking much like this picture much of the time. And the long-standing debate about hope versus fear in environmental communications, which often concludes by saying that people will only act if they are given hopeful narratives and therefore avoid doom and gloom at all costs, is tired, ineffective, and inadequate for moving forward. We have to go beyond black and white thinking, beyond binaries, to get at a richer, more nuanced, and more authentic way of speaking to what many people are feeling and observing. Because as the situation has worsened, the dominant culture's obsession with easy hope, techno fixes, and convenient stories has grown less credible. And people crave something that will motivate them in a gritty way. Balancing hope and fear, by doing this, we become more mature, and we learn to tolerate the difficult truth of our vulnerability, is that no one can guarantee that we're going to pull this all off, whatever our dreams for saving the world may be. But we can sit with that and keep taking right action anyway. I get asked a lot about what gives me hope, given that what I study is inherently pretty depressing, so it's an understandable question. And it really depends on your definition of hope. And the best definition of hope that I've found so far comes from the Czech statesman and poet Václav Havel, who tells us that hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. And when enough people act from this kind of hope, it does cause a tidal wave of change. And I'm continually finding evidence that many people do indeed act from this place, which naturally undergirds my hope. The climate-aware therapist Caroline Hickman says that the climate crisis is an invitation for us to engage in internal activism. So the idea here is that activism is not only external, rooted in protests and policymaking as we typically think of it, it also occurs on the inside, as we can grow our tolerance for difficult emotions that are a natural part of confronting the environmental crisis. But this demands that we step away from any kind of positive psychology framing that tells us that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad, and then deal with the shame that ensues. Despair and fear are not inherently bad. Hope and optimism are not inherently good. For instance, it can take courage to admit cowardice. We must move from an either-or to a both-and model because there is meaning in every emotion. And once we can sit with our eco-emotions with an element of curiosity and give them space without self-judgment, well, the insights that they carry start to reveal themselves about what we care to see happen and what we ought to do next. It's a lot like the poem by the Persian poet Rumi called The Guest House, and while I'm up here being all mushy, I may as well read it to you. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. From my qualitative research on the emotional impacts of climate, I've heard from countless people that the most important thing that helped them on their coping journey was to find others who give permission to their disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not recognized, that we lack social norms for supporting and talking about, and we often see it pop up around things like fertility issues, abortion, and suicide. When we lack social norms, we lack support for processing these kinds of losses, but that bubble of silence is damaging. Most of the time, feelings of ecological grief and climate distress are so uncomfortable because a person sits alone in them, alienated from others and ashamed for caring so much, wondering honestly if there's something wrong with them. But as soon as they connect with others who can validate these feelings, give permission to them, mirror them, well then, paradoxically, relief quickly follows, especially if there's no attempt to minimize their severity or argue their validity. There's now a cottage industry of peer support networks and professional mental health alliances that have sprung up to help people metabolize their traumatic climate and ecological thoughts, feelings, and experiences constructively. From the Eco-Anxiety Africa Project to climate-aware therapists organized in the Climate Psychology Alliances of North America and the United Kingdom and the Climate Psychiatry Alliance too. For instance, the Good Grief Network runs a 10-step program modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous for helping people sit with uncertainty and reinvest the energy they've lost from being eco-anxious into actions that matter at this time and that are authentic to them. I have argued before that eco-anxiety is a resource now floating freely in the air and that it is this generation's job to capture it and harness it for positive outcomes, environmental and otherwise. People often push me on that point, asking how on earth they're supposed to harness their distress into something positive. There are many ways, and one way I like to look at this process is through the work of Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who studied the psychology of 20th century atrocities, from Nazis who ran concentration camps to people who survived the bomb in Hiroshima. Lifton tells us that while a survivor is someone who has touched death but made it out alive, a prospective survivor is someone who vividly imagines how they might be obliterated and then uses the energy that comes from that envisioning to take on life-protecting actions at this time. In his book, The Climate Swerve, Lifton writes, "As prospective survivors, we can find meaning in our actions to combat climate change. We can take on a survivor mission of preserving our habitat and embracing genuine forms of adaptation for our species. In doing so, we reassert our larger human connectedness, our bond with our species." And I would just extend this by saying our bond with other species too. At its simplest, the prospective survivor with a mind so sensitively attuned to the threat of complete annihilation may hold the power to shake things up and bring about new ways of being human that we now sorely need. What the prospective survivor does not do is make peace with death or collapse. She sometimes even finds joy in pushing against them and would rather die trying arm in arm with others just like her than in a state of surrender. When enough people generate existential meaning by stepping into this role, they muster the life force that prevent the worst outcomes from happening. And in this way, the prospective survivor can help us channel eco-distress into radical hope. But the path to becoming a prospective survivor isn't exactly obvious to many people. It's not intuitive, and many need guidance. Scores of environmental educators around the world have started noticing that simply by doing their job, by showing up to the classroom and teaching curriculum that deals with global environmental problems, that they're causing their students to despair and feel fatalistic about their own futures. The material is just too heavy, and they often want to switch programs. But the problem may not be that the facts are daunting and overwhelming as much as that the feelings they conjure are never addressed. A few years ago, a professor named Jennifer Atkinson at the University of Washington created a course to engage with her environmental science students' despair using art, literature, film, and psychology. It quickly filled up as soon as it was offered. Class was absolutely topped out the morning after it was put online, and it has been offered every year since with full attendance. Students who long felt deviant and alone in their severity for the concern of what is happening to the earth could for the first time safely express how they felt with others who understood, finding solidarity in their ecological distress, as well as new ways of thinking critically about the problem as well as their own role within it. Therapeutic relief followed, as well as a commitment to stay in their studies for many students, because at the end of the day, community saves. As one student wrote in the course evaluation form, "This class has taught me that grief must be felt, but love maybe more so, and that even in times of absolute disaster, the world keeps turning and humans help each other." Thanks to a distressed and isolated climate science graduate student who reached out to me last year, I am now teaching a similar course at Stanford University's new Doerr School of Sustainability called Confronting Emotions in the Climate Sciences, which aims to equip the next generation of climate scientists with psychosocial supports and skills for doing their work that don't leave them at the mercy of unhealthy coping mechanisms such as emotional suppression, which multiple studies have shown is a typical coping mechanism in the climate science community writ large. Transformative change is coming, whether we like it or not, and we have an opportunity to be wise in how we go about helping each other navigate it as we work to build a more socially just and equitable world, which involves creating new norms for processing and supporting ecologically linked distress. And even if you are not feeling eco-anxious, which is perfectly understandable, not everyone feels this, many of our young people are, and we owe it to them to take their pain seriously by addressing the institutional betrayal that makes them feel like adults largely on this one have left the building and like these problems are theirs alone to solve. Without doubt, charting a path to achieving 30 by 30 at IMPAC5 is a key way of doing this. And so I hope that rather than belittle eco-distress as weakness whenever we see it pop up, we can recognize it for the superfuel that it is and harness its powerful energy for moral leadership in planetary health. And so I'd like to conclude with a quotation from colleagues who write very eloquently in The Lancet about what all of this offers us when they say, recognizing that emotions are what lead people to act, it is possible that feelings of ecological anxiety and grief, though uncomfortable, are in fact the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction that are required for the life-saving changes now needed. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the Congress.